Thank you very much for the invitation, the hospitality, Latin America, and also art history and the Tiwi Museum. So everybody have been really wonderful, kind of organizing activities and lunches and conversations. So and thank you for coming. I see that the sun is, but it's late. Today that the sun is out, so we have to be inside. So I put this, you may recognize that, right? So the idea is to invite you to change channel, because the tendency is that Latin America is something over there, someplace in the West, I don't know what the West is, and it's an entity that's a kind of in itself. So I want to get to change its channel. I'm trying to think about that entity. It's a part of the world order, right? So the second button of the channel that I invite you to change, I am not a Latin Americanist. My PhD is on semiotics, but then by the 80s, I began to realize how people look at you when you come from Latin America, even if you are, at that time, blonde with blue eyes, right? So everything I did since more or less the 1980s, early 80s, is out of anger and personal research. So people see myself as a good scholar. That is not what I was trying to do. A weapon I had is because I was kind of trained in a PhD. So my weapon was to do research and to build argument. But the question was not to study Latin America. The question was, America have to reason for me? Well, I was coming from there. I had some kind of living experience. And the second is that everything that we are living today, the order of the world order today, is based on what happened in the 16th century. Not in Latin America, but in the Americas, in the Atlantic, rather. Not just in the America, but the Atlantic. And the Atlantic meaning the Americas, west of Africa, and west of Europe. So that is a kind of the foundation of the world order that we have today. So, but for 500 years, 5 centuries, the Atlantic was the center. Before that was the Mediterranean. Before that was the Indic Ocean. But in the 16th century, things moved to the Atlantic. And in the 21st century, it's in a reversible shift to the Eastern Hemisphere. You may like it or not, but that is the way it is. When half of the people live in that part of the world, and you have an economic system that we call capitalism, you cannot stop the shift, except with a kind of the nuclear war. But you cannot stop the economic growth in the Eastern Hemisphere. And economic growth with the Eastern Hemisphere means a lot of other things. It means regaining confidence of the people who inhabit this part of the hemisphere. That has an incidence in pride, in knowledge, in creativity, in not feeling anymore that we need first to learn from the West to kind of become ourselves. The West cannot be forgotten. It's in all of us, but there is no reason anymore to be a slave of the West or to follow their rules. So this is a kind of small introduction. This is how this talk was announced. So we are all in the same page. Is Latin American part of the West? Why ask this question and what to do, and what to do these terms mean for understanding the world today? In this lecture, I didn't write that. In this lecture, Professor Mignolo will ask what. No, I say that this is what has been announced, so I want to just try to not to disappoint you too much. He will also look at the role of the name of Latin America. So, the first point I want to make here is, again, changing your channel. I am not talking about what a Latin American is. That is a very modern Western way of addressing things. Decolonially, we never ask what something is. Decolonially, we always ask how what we think is came to be. So how Latin America came to be? People today talk about Latin American colonial history. It's simply barbarity because, I mean, there was no Latin American in the colonial history. It was not even America, even less Latin America. So this is the kind of issues I will address, not what a Latin American is, but how Latin American came to be and what does it mean today in the current world order. So I have two parts. The first part is conceptual and historical, and then the second part is kind of getting some consequences of this narrative. I hesitated a lot to start with this, but then I decided that because I will need just a lecture to explain this and 2 or 3 more diagrams. But I want to tell you about this is that I am not a historian, but I work with the past. But the past I work with is conceptual. It's the formation, transformation, management, and control of the colonial matrix of power. When we say coloniality, in short, we mean colonial matrix of power. When we say coloniality of power, we mean colonial matrix of power. But when we say just coloniality, because not need to go into detail. So what is coloniality is the darker side of modernity for us. When I say us, it's a group of people that, yes, think from the history of South America in the same way that Foucault thinks from the history of Europe. And Marx thought about the history of Germany and England at the moment of the Industrial Revolution. So there are different kind of local histories. So, so the colonial metric of power, to go quickly, is like the unconscious of Western civilization. So you see, this unconscious doesn't exist. The unconscious is not an entity. It's not an ontic entity. The unconscious is an invention of Freud, right? So Freud invented the unconscious and invented psychoanalysis. So psychoanalysis exists because the unconscious exists because of psychoanalysis. So in our case, the colonial matrix of power doesn't exist. We created it. It's kind of analytic tool. So decoloniality for us means the creation of the analytic of the colonial matrix of power, and the colonial matrix of power is the way we understand decoloniality. It's a very specific understanding of decolonial. People use decolonial in many ways. I am not a judge to say who is using it good or bad. The only thing I will say is that this is the way I use it. The rest is their problem. So basically, the colonial measure of power, because I want to talk about that, has 4 domains. The domain of knowledge, understanding, and you can put art and culture and everything that is we call culture. But not to put culture is knowledge and understanding, how knowledge manage us. Authority, we can put the nation state, monarchy, democracy, those are the kind of the dominant or hegemonic keywords. the domain of the economy, which is not the same than capitalism. A lot of people think that capitalism is the same as economy. No, but there are two different things. I mean, capitalism is one form of economy that became hegemonic and dominant, and that is a big struggle today. And then the concept of man. That is very, very important because man was self-defined as human. And self-defining as human kind of managed to make other people inferior because of race, because of sexual preference, because of nationality, because of religion, because of language, because of whatever. So racism is nothing to do with nothing. Racism it's not a question of skin. It's not a question of blood. Racism is a question of who controls knowledge and has the power to classify and convince people that that is reality, right? So those are the four domains, and those are controlled by what we call the enunciation. So what appears to us as reality is indeed the effect of the colonial matrix of power. So our fight is not with reality, because there is no reality per se. So reality is reality always for somebody. There is no objectivity that the science claims in relation to reality. Reality and objectivity are arguments to convince. If you are in a discussion and somebody said, come on, be realistic, or come on, be objective, what that person is telling you, think like me. So the colonial matrix of power is this kind of monster that was formed during the 16th century, transformed, and today is under dispute. So now I go to more kind of historical moment, and at the end I will come back to what happened to the colonial matrix of powers today, right? So this is the abstract scheme, but now you can see the historical reference I will give you are thought out in relation to this scheme. Okay, I give you 30 seconds. What was the world order before 1500? I want to ask you a response, but I give you 30 seconds to think about. What was the world order before 1500? You can say 1492, but I mean, it's not just a kind of a specific. So before 1500, there were a lot of formation we call civilization today. There were the Chinese dynasties. There was the Khanate of Genghis Khan. There was India. There was Persia. There were the Ottomans that were kind of coming up. There were the kingdoms of Africa, many. There were the Aztecs, the Mayas, the Aztecs. Many, 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 many civilizations. So there was commerce. And none, I mean, these civilizations were not paradise. There were different kind of exploitation, difference, etc. But there was no one single civilization that controlled, intervene, destroy, disavow, because of knowledge, had the power to disavow other civilizations. That is what happened in 1500s. One civilization, the youngest of all, because 1500 was no Western civilization yet. There was a bunch of Western Christians in what we call today Europe that lost Jerusalem, and they were desperate to think about what do we do now? How can we expand Christianity now that we cannot go there because the Ottoman cut the road, right? And they landed. So in the 16th century, Western civilization began to be formed, and the combination of the history of Europe itself, of course, but they come in the kind of the Middle Ages, the European Middle Ages, the European Renaissance. But then the European Renaissance cannot be understood without the Americas, without the kind of the invention of America. So the Americas become the darker side of the Renaissance. The dark side were the witches, the kind of all these people who kind of were friends of the devil. That was the kind of Europe was trying to control. So the Western civilization is not, again, an entity. It's not the unfolding of universal history that Hegel told later on and kind of ended up in Germany, which is where the center of Europe and the center of the world, was not Western civilization until that moment. So the Western civilization is a set of cumulative narrative of people who themselves are the actors and the narrators of Western civilization. And at the same time, began to classify and rank the people and the world. So my answer to my own question is that before 1500, the world order was polycentric, was non-capitalist. Of course, there was a lot of economies, but the economy were the surplus was saved for trade, or just in case you have kind of an emergency, a drought, or whatever. But there was not an economy of investing the surplus to produce more. So everything here is related to slave trade, to races, to kind of exploitation and dismantling. It's dismantling of the civilization of the Aztec, the Inca, etc., but at the same time the exploitation of labor of the indigenous people. No? So it was a polycentric world order. Was not oriented to accumulation of wealth, was oriented to dominion, of course, but not accumulation of wealth. That is why you don't have antecedent in Greece of economy. You can find everything you want in Greece that is today alive, but you don't find an economist until Adam Smith in the 18th century. Why the first political economist, as they say today, appears in the 18th century. Okay, so was not accumulation of wealth, but Smith talked about the wealth of nations. Was not exploitation of labor in the way that exploitation of labor became with kind of slavery. Of course, were a slave in Greece, and they were kind of exploited, but the kind of a massive exploitation of labor, a massive slave trade. And that made, introduce something, a new element that is crucial today, is the disposability of human life. Human beings were inferior, but never disposable. And that is what slavery introduced. You bring in a slave, or 100, and if they get sick in the ocean, you just throw it away, because then you have to pay insurance, you have to take care. And then when the life of the slave is no longer productive, it's like the Coca-Cola. You just drink the Coca-Cola and then throw the can. That is the disposability of human life. And that never was abandoned. That you see it today all over. We are not precarious, we are disposable. That's a kind of the difference. Precarity probably is the stage before disposability, but we are precarious because the states don't care about human being or the nation, right? Okay, so, and then after the Industrial Revolution, the life became disposable, and that is the question, and that is the problem we have now with ecological crisis and climate crisis and all these kind of things, right? But that kind of, there is a mentality, there is a way of thinking and a way of being and a way of sensing that is part of the knowledge, man, subjectivity, and the colonial nature of power, right? Okay. Now, another thing that happened in the 16th century is that no one in any place have this image of the planet. This is 1570, when the navigation made possible to kind of people to have a kind of experience of the different parts of the planet. So that is a tremendous importance, because for knowledge, understanding, and sensibility, that image control our imaginary, but also control our senses. Right? Who control knowledge, control your sensibility. So technology now and artificial intelligence, they know what they are doing. Okay, before 1500, and before that map, there were these kind of things. I mean, all this kind of civilization. I won't go all over the civilization. I give you three. China was the famous nested rectangles. Of course, people farther away from the center were was inferior to the people in the center. But they were not kind of treated as a slave, and indigenous began to be treated. For the Aztecs, the world order is very, very, very complex. It's very complex because, as a student of mine said, the Aztecs didn't have a space. Oh, how can I have a space? Well, yeah, of course, because you cannot, I mean, space and time are a kind of Western category, and you cannot ask what was the space and time for the other. No, why don't we ask what was Tlacautli for the West? Why we have to ask what was the space and time for the Aztec, and not to ask what was Tlacautli for the West? And Tlacautli was that. So Tlacautli was a kind of organization, that's a plane of the earth, but also in relation, as many other cosmologies, to heavens, and the underworld, which is not hell, was just where the sun and the moon goes when you don't see it. They are kind of moving around. So this is a very complex description or narrative, more than description, it's a narrative of the four parts of the world, because all the kind of indigenous cosmology is from the Navajos to the Mapuche to the kind of, the world is conceiving four parts. But the four parts are not just kind of space, kind of there are narratives, there are stories in each of these parts. But then there is something that complicates things, that is Ollin, O-L-L-I-N. And Ollin is movement. So you cannot kind of conceive this without a movement, which is the constant flux and the constant movement of the wind, of the moon, of the sun, of this, etc., etc. And the Christians have their own, why not? They deserve it to have their own concept of the world, like many others. Yeah? And as you may know, this is the famous T-in-O map that you find it in Isidoro Seville, but probably before that, 7th century. And for them, the planet or the Earth was divided in three, not divided in four, not the kind of nested rectangle, and according to the three sons of Noah, Sem, Sham, and Japheth. And there was a hierarchy there, because of course, Sham, we know, was the kind of bad son of Noah. So the Africa was already done in the kind of the Christian cosmology. Sem was better, and so they gave it to Asia. And you see this in the map of the 17th century. And Japheth was the hope, heir, the expansion, Europe. So, and we can go around other kind of civilization, and everybody have their own kind of cosmology, this kind of narrative, how the world was created, how the human being has been created, etc., etc. So we don't have to believe the Big Bang theory. There's one narrative. Why we have to give preference to the Big Bang? I think we have to listen to the Big Bang. I mean, they have the right to tell the story, but there is no reason to give the Big Bang the privilege of other narrative. So all of that was before 1500, and then comes this map, and erase everything, and then the idea of modernity come into the picture, because everything else is traditional, and it had to be superseded. So the crucial moment of that today is 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas, and 1529, the Treaty of Zaragoza. So the Treaty of Tordesillas is very well known. Alfonso VI appropriate Indias Occidentales. There was no America. It's Indias Occidentales, and give it to the Spanish and the Portuguese. And in 1529, the King of Portugal, and Alfonso was no longer there, the King and Portugal and Spain like the idea, so they get together, and they divide Indias Orientales. So the Macau has been founded in 1536, and then Formosa, which is now Taiwan, and the Philippines is this moment. So people said today that the East and the West are construction. Of course are construction. The question is, who did it? Why? When? What for? So here you have from Indias Occidentales and Indias Orientales, which was the kind of the Iberian division. When the Dutch and the German began to take control of knowledge, they invent the East and the West, the Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere. But the Western Hemisphere and the Eastern Hemisphere have here the historical foundation. So it's not an ontic foundation, it's a knowledge and understanding foundation that affect how we see, how we feel, how we sense the planet we are inhabiting. Okay, so, but a lot of things, interesting things happen that have to be, that will help to kind of understand what I'm trying to argue. In 1582, more or less, Matthew Ritchie, which was a Jesuit priest from Rome, went to Japan and China, and apparently he took this map, the one I showed you before, the Ortelius map, and invited the narrative by Matthew Ritchie himself, invited the intellectual or the wise men of the Ming Dynasty, and showed that map. And apparently the wise men said, well, very polite, I imagine, though that is a very interesting map, but why, if China is at the center, as I showed you before, right? Is China at the center, why you put it there on the upper right corner? Right? So apparently Matthew Ritchie reflected, and 2 or 3 weeks later he invited them back, and he showed that map, this map, which is today, I don't know here, but I saw that map in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, in China, in Japan, where the Pacific is in the center. And China, evidently, why Europe? China. So you see what the kind of began to uncouple things with images and words and figures, etc. So for whom something is as it is, right? You follow me? Yeah, okay. So it's very interesting because the consequence of how people reason today. In 2015 appeared this, there was a lot of articles discussing this. That Shen He discovered America before Columbus. And this is one. There are many others. The Viking, the Africans. I give you that example to kind of help you to shift the way we think about these kind of issues. Nobody could have discovered America before Columbus because America didn't exist. Not even Columbus discovered America. Right? So that is kind of what we call decolonial thinking, to kind of to think about how things came to be. So was no America to be discovered. Was Tawantinsuyo, was Anahuac, was Walmapu, was Turtle Island. So every kind of cultural civilization have their own Abya Yala, but was no America. America was an invention, a European invention. Was not discovered, not invented. That has been said several years ago, but has to be repeated because people keep on talking about American, Latin American, colonial Latin America, so you have to keep on pushing. So most likely, this map that's supposed to be in the 18th century is a copy of that map, right? But that, and so that's one point, that this is discover America because America didn't exist. And the second point, which is, can make me really kind of mad when I hear the kind of argument. Even if 20 different people and different moments got to this land before Columbus, that is absolutely irrelevant. Is only relevant for a modern mentality that who comes first wins. If there are, whoever came here first didn't make the mess that Columbus did. And what is important here is that we are living the consequences of the mess that Columbus did, not because he was great, but because the Christian and the monarchy of Spain were kind of behind him to trying to so I give you this example in order to kind of shift the way we think about this kind of issue. So this, a little bit of conceptual structure and a little bit of historical thing to see how the conceptual structure help us to understand the historical and this historical help us to understand. Now, a little bit of, I don't want to go over time. I started at 22. I want to just 50 minutes, 1 hour. I don't want to go over that. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about dates. So, 1500, 2000. That's a big scheme. Remember, the war after 1500. We look about how, before 1500 and then what happened in 1500. From 1500 to 2000 was the westernization of the world. You won't have had the British here, or in India, or the Dutch in South Africa, if you didn't have the Atlantic in the 16th century. Because what happened in the 16th century was dominated by Portugal and Spain, and the Dutch and the French and the British were very jealous. So that is why in 1600 and 1601, the British created the East Indies companies. Where is Indies coming from? Spanish. And the Dutch, the East Indies, the Dutch East Indies company. So Indonesia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia, right? And a little bit later, 2 centuries, 1718, 2.5 centuries later, the Opium War. The Opium War is connected to what happened in the 16th century. There is no Opium War. I don't know what the history could have been, but now I am totally convinced that you cannot separate the Opium War or the colonization, the dismantling of the Mughal Sultanate and the British there, or the fight between the British and the Dutch in South Africa, to give you some few examples. So the question is, the colonial measure of power is not something that was like a cookie cutter, that was a kind of, or a butterfly net, that the European came with that and chased it. No, was a process of forming itself to deal with the problems that, on the one hand, the discovery of land and people brought to them, and then the imperial conflict. So the Dutch and the French and the British were not just coming here, they were fighting over there, and the Caribbean was one of the kind of the center of the conflict, and United States comes because of the... So 1500, 2000 is the formation, transformation, and management of that monster I showed you at the beginning, the colonial measure of power. And that is in the hands of Western power. The Iberian, the Dutch, the French, the British, mainly, and then United States. There are family feuds, there are religious war, they kill themselves, the treaty was failure, but that was kind of family feud. They were all Christians, they were all men, and in general they were all kind of heterosexual. Probably they were not heterosexual, they didn't say it at that time, was not well seen, right? So it was family feud, and they control the world. They fight against themselves, but they control the world. So that is the westernization of the world, and I will tell you what happened. So 1600, 1601, so the British and the Dutch, and still we don't have Latin America. We have America, and the name America erased Anahuac, Tawantinsuyo, Turtle Island, and New Zealand erased Aotearoa, and now we begin to see that it's a very similar kind of phenomenon. So between 1750 and 1945, Britain and France were the global leader that take it over from Spain and Portugal. Spain and Portugal were still there. Christianity was still there. The missionaries were all over. But the Protestants were kind of taking over the leadership that the Catholic had before, right? So that happened the Industrial Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution kind of, the railroad and massive kind of control of the interior of the territories, and the need more and more of natural resources. Natural resources that create today the kind of the climate crisis that we are talking about, because the Industrial Revolution, as we know, was not created with renewable energy, it was created by non-renewable energy. Now everybody's fighting for the oil in Venezuela, in Iran, and all this kind of stuff. So 17, Britain, and here is, in the middle of that, is where Latin America emerged. There is no Latin America until the second half of 19th century. Everybody, South and North, talk about America. In the United States, they thought that America was them, but in the South, Mexico, Argentina, they were talking about America. We live in America. But what happened? What happened is, I should have put it here, but I just tell you, the American-Mexican War 1845, 46, more or less. And the treaty, you know about treaty, right? And the Treaty Guadalupe Hidalgo. By the Treaty Guadalupe Hidalgo, United States takes a tremendous amount of land from Mexico, like the British did here. California, Texas, Colorado, all that were kind of Mexican, Spanish, and then Mexican, and then United States. So France was looking at that time, I mean, they were the leadership with England. So the French began to see that the US, which was still marginal, they were not yet competing for the world order. Who controlled it was the French and the British. The United States was building itself. But the French saw that, hey, they are coming too dangerous to the south. We have to stop that. So they did two things. They managed to put Maximiliano, a French emperor, and they managed to lobby the officers of the state in South America, in the America of the South, to change the name and to name it Latin America, so they can stop the advance of Anglo-America. And that is very interesting because then you see a mirror image of Europe in the 19th century and the Americas, almost a mirror image. Why? Because at that moment, third point, France is taking the leadership of the south of Europe, right? In front of the Anglo-Saxon of the north. So that is the moment in which the invention of the south of Europe takes place, more or less parallel to the invention of Orientalism. Orientalism and the south of Europe are simultaneous control of knowledge to make people inferior, because south of Europe, come on, you're southern, you like siesta, you like toros, you are mixed with the Muslim, you are close to Africa. So that is the south of Spain, right, from the north. And that is the south of America. It's a kind of almost a mirror image of how the Constitution of America is imagined, but imposed in the kind of the belief. And people in South America began to believe that we are inferior. It took us a while to kind of figure out what was the trick. And that is part of the research, you know? That's part of the research to kind of dismantle those kind of arguments, but at the same time, it's emotional too. You have to kind of affirm yourself. Like, hey, who in the world are you to believe what you have the right to believe what you believe? I respect that. But I don't respect the aberration. And the aberration is to think that what you think is how the world is, right? So that is the invention of Latin America. So Latin American is not a subcontinent. Latin American is the political project of people European descent in complicity with the French leadership. And what happened is that Latin America marginalized what is today Abya Yala, which will be your ahora, and which is La Gran Comarca. You don't have that, but La Gran Comarca is the territory of people of African descent. So they say, well, that line that divides Ecuador and Colombia, that's your problem. We live in La Gran Comarca. That is a problem with state. The Gran Comarca is other kind of organization. So, and that coexists, like coexists New Zealand with our Ahora, right? We have to get used to that there is a coexistence today of territoriality. Indigenous people live in Abya Yala, non-indigenous in Latin America. And when when Latin America say, but you live in Latin America, why you pretend that you're Abya-Yala? They say, but you live in Abya-Yala, why do you pretend that that is Latin America, right? So that is the question that is at stake on kind of maintaining the idea that Latin America corresponds to reality, that Latin America named objectively a subcontinent. No, Latin American is a creation, is an invention of certain people in order to marginalize the other, but now, today, Afro and indigenous are no longer buying into this kind of story, right? So, and, okay, I'm doing well, I'm controlling myself. So, and then we go 1945, 2000. And until 1945, if you look, you won't find in the document, and if you find it will be very rare, nobody talk about Latin America before 1945. Nobody talk about Latin America until 1964, which was the creation of LASA, the Latin American Studies Association. So in a way, Latin America was kind of captured by the confabulation of US social scientists, but also Latin American social scientists here and there, right? And what is very interesting is how Latin America, again, is refashioned. You see the colonial matrix of power, how it changed? It's refashioned in the sense that the invention of the second invention of Latin America corresponds to the creation of area studies in United States. When United States took the control, political, economic, control of knowledge too. And it was a very interesting, forgotten, but I have to remember those things that have been forgotten, a very interesting distribution of the intellectual and scientific labor with the creation of area studies. That then were disputed and still, but the distribution of labor was more or less like this. The hard social science, which is economy and political science mainly, studied developed countries that are the only one that really deserve to be studied, so you can develop. Remember, the motto in 1949, Harry Truman, is no longer progress and civilization like the British and the French, no longer salvation by conversion, which was before the Christian, now is modernization and development. And look what happened, then I come to Aristides again, but look what happened in this change of words. That if you don't pay attention to this, you think that those kind of project that has to be the kind of progress, or it's just a kind of evolution of human history. But what happened here is that progress and civilization kind of balance the material economic progress with the civilizing mission. Well, we are not going to save those people to convert it to Christianity. We will save them by civilizing them. But when you have modernization and development, forget about civilization. It's all pure economy. Modernization equal development, development equal modernization. And this was a drastic change, and we are living the consequence today more and more. What happened is that up to that point, the economy was always very important, of course, but was part of society. Second half of the 20th century, society is part of the economy. And that is the world we are living in, and we have to pay very much attention because we have become citizens. Before we were citizens, civilized citizens, and then we became consumers. And with technology, we become users. So, citizen, consumers, user. That is the disposability of human life. We don't care as people as, they don't care as, we don't count as people or person. We count as soon as we can vote. We are civic, civilized. We count, we can consume. And we count if we can be enslaved by technology. Kind of iPod all the time. So these are different moments, and you can, in the abstract, you can see the transformation of different aspects of the colonial matrix of power. Now, what happened after that? I press my... What happened now until 2050, right? But let me, I forgot to finish one story, the distribution of scientific labor. So the sociology and political science study developed society. Sociology and economy studies develop society so we can understand and kind of make progress and civilization and modernization. Political science, so economy and sociology study develop undemocratic societies, which also scientific society. Political science came into the Soviet Union because they are technologically advanced, scientifically advanced, but they are not democratic and objective. They are ideological. We are objective. They are ideological. So political science goes there. And then in the 50s was invented the Third World, that now disappeared because the end of the Soviet Union, so we talk about the Global South. So the Global South is a convenient kind of replacement of the Third World division. So what happened to the Third World? They give it to the anthropologists. So why? Because the Third World doesn't produce science, doesn't produce knowledge, produce culture. So the anthropologists study culture. So that is the distribution of scientific labor, and that is a kind of epistemic racism. The only knowledge, valid knowledge, scientific knowledge, objective knowledge, the knowledge of man, and man is Western. White, none other men and women of color, they are kind of out. They have to modernize, civilize. They have to come to or go to the European, to Harvard or to Bingham or something like that, which is happening now. But there is a very interesting phenomenon of reversal. So let's go now to the 2050. I may not see that end, but it's just a guess based on what we are today. So what was important in the 50s, that was the Third World, was the Bandung Conference. That was forgotten because the non-aligned movement of the 61, but now it's kind of coming back. If I have time, I will tell you what is the difference, but I have 9 minutes. The Bandung Conference, 1955, the struggle for decolonization were all over Asia and Africa. Latin America was different because Latin America became independent since the beginning of the 19th century. So most of the nation state, the republic in South America, were created between 1809 and 1830, more or less. There are others in the Caribbean. Brazil have a kind of different story. But basically, that struggle that people in Africa and Asia were fighting was already fought in South America, and they kind of get rid of Portugal and Spain. They got independent, so they have the independence to give themselves to the French and the British. Right? That's what they did. It was very convenient. Huh? The British put the railroad, and they took all the crops and the land, and the French give us the intellect. Right? So we put the Spain and Portugal back in the back burner. So the Cuban Revolution was 59 was into that movement. So the struggle of decolonization goes more or less between 1945 and 1970. But the Iranian Revolution is 79, but most of the struggle, the independence, have already been gained by 1970. But the Bandung Conference remained as the kind of the anchor. The anchor, the symbol, and the reference point. Then you can go to different specific struggle. The Bandung Conference was organized by Sukarno, the first president of Indonesia. And he invited 20 nations from Asia and Africa. Not Russia, well, that is Eurasia, but yes, China. Zhou Enlai was there. Suspicious, but was invited. Because, I mean, Mao was still the Second World. Huh? And the Bandung Conference was neither communism nor capitalism, but decolonization. And that's what we talk about decolonization. Now we have to remember that. But decolonization at that moment meant to form our own nation state, like what happened in South America, in Latin America, or in all the Americas, including Haiti, that I didn't make reference yet, but it's important here. So that is one of the important legacies of Bandung. Neither capitalism nor communism, but decolonization. And decolonization meant to form your own nation state. That was, of course, the kiss of the death, because the nation state was already ingrained in the kind of control of authority of the colonial measure of power, and that is what we have seen happen to all the kind of countries that have been decolonized at the time. And we see the problem today, right? In South Africa, Nigeria, in Syria, etc. But in retrospect, there are two legacies of the Bandung Conference. One is decolonization, decoloniality, I will explain, but the other is de-Westernization. And de-Westernization changed quite a bit the way we understand the world order, because there is no longer second world. A lot of people today talk about a new Cold War between China and the United States. No, it's not a Cold War. It's not a Cold War. Why is not a Cold War? I mean, you can metaphorically say Cold War, but you cannot make an analogy with Russia and the United States. Why? Because communism, state communism and liberal capitalism were two brothers of the Enlightenment. China doesn't come from there, right? And if Russia comes from there, is a different kind of story. Russia is not linked to the European Enlightenment the same way that France and Germany and England is. And have a different kind of skin. They are Slav, they have Cyrillic alphabet, they have Orthodox Christianity. There is a lot of difference. So what happened in the Westernization that didn't happen in the Cold War is that in the Westernization, the cultural memory is very important. While in general, both Stalin and Mao kind of eliminated Confucius and Mencius, and Stalin also kind of, in order to modernize, kind of marginalize Christianity, make some kind of arrangement later on for convenience, but not because he was secular. So secularism kind of force you to do this kind of thing. So that's one thing, that de-Westernization is, number one, a state-led project. And number two, is a state-led project that trying to kind of build itself, rebuilding what Western modernity destroyed, or Western modernity told them that they should despise and become Western. So when I said that, people say, oh yeah, but the Chinese state uses Confucius and Mencius for his own purposes. And my answer is, yes, indeed, you are absolutely right. They are doing exactly the same thing that the West is doing with democracy, going back to the Greece and building in kind of that tradition that pretend to be universal. So, de-Westernization, and the third point is that de-Westernization you cannot say that China is neoliberal, we cannot say that Russia is neoliberal, and we can even less say that Iran is neoliberal. Why? Because a lot of people confuse neoliberal with capitalism and consumerism. But capitalism was always consumerism. You don't need neoliberalism. But you can say that neoliberalism kind of emphasizes a kind of consumerism and all that. But for me, the most important point of neoliberalism, and that is why de-Westernization is important to understand, neoliberals want to homogenize the world. And that is not longer possible, right? That is where we are today with a kind of struggle between United States and Russia and China and Iran. So after Bush and Cheney, the West began to lose hegemony and now have to resort to domination, using Gramsci's term. And that is what we are seeing today, right? So the question is, the global order is capitalist, but at the same time is capitalism what allows China and Russia and Iran to kind of delink from the order given by the World Bank. So in that sense, I see Bandung as the seed of de-Westernization. And to give you one more element is, you see, Lee Kuan Yew in 1964 began to build Singapore in a very important commercial center, financial center. Lee Kuan Yew was too young to be in Bandung, and also he didn't have any kind of position to be invited to Bandung. But being in Malaysia, obviously he was paying attention to what was going on in Bandung, right? So he uses the state to build, through capitalism, its own kind of identity. He was criticized for many reasons, for kind of the rhetoric of the family and the hand, etc., etc. But at the same time, I think that Lee Kuan Yew understood that the only way that they can reaffirm themselves was through appropriating, stealing capitalism through the financial aspect of capitalism. That's one thing. And when Deng Xiaoping, after the death of Mao, Deng Xiaoping took over, what he did was to go talk to Lee Kuan Yew. It was a kind of constant kind of conversation between. So, de-Westernization, Bandung, Indonesia, Singapore, China. And that, after 2000, began to create a discomfort with the West. So the West controlled the colonial measure of power 1500 to 2000, but can no longer control it. So they created Frankenstein, and Frankenstein escaped the lab. So what the West is doing now through the United States is re-Westernize. But since they lost hegemony, they have to re-Westernize through domination. And that is very dangerous. I mean, I think that many people have said that the most dangerous country today for world peace is United States. Why? Because it's very hard to lose privilege. And that is not just a kind of rational political theory, that is in your gut. How can you give up that kind of accumulation of privileges of all kinds, not just privilege, economic privilege, that has been accumulated for 500 years? So we have de-Westernization and re-Westernization. Now the West is playing defense. For 500 years, the West played offense. Now it's de-Westernization that's playing offense. And that is why the United States said we have to contain China. We have to contain Russia. What is that language? We are playing defense. They are going too fast. We have to stop them, right? So those are state-led projects. De-Westernization state project. It's not our project, it's state. So what is Latin America there? Well, there was never turn to the left in Latin America. Chavez, Lula, Morales, Correa, I am missing somebody here. They were never lefty, they were de-Westernizer. They were capitalists, confronted the United States, making kind of deals with Iran, with China, with Russia. But you see, a small states are like the wind. When you change the wind, so Brazil was a very important member of the BRICS country, which was one of the association of the kind of de-Westernization, the early moment of de-Westernization. But now with Temer and Bolsonaro, so what we have is just China, Russia, and India, the BRIC. So now if today the election, the preliminary election in Argentina gave a huge margin to Fernández, the kind of the Unión para Todos, the kind of the Peronistas legacies, a huge margin of 17 points for the final election in October. So if that happened, because Macri is very kind of a servant of re-Westernization, he is a kind of child of Trump. So if Fernández come into the picture, well, I don't know how much they can do, but they will ally again with Russia and China and Iran. Even if the United States will do everything possible to stop them. But we don't have anymore this kind of strong cohort of Chavez, Lula, and then Dilma, and then Correa, and Morales, and the Kirchner in Argentina. That was a very strong moment, but was not socialist, was not decolonial, was de-Western. Being capitalist, but at the same time not follow the desire of the IMF, the World Bank, et cetera, to go in a different kind of direction. So re-Westernization emerged because of the closing of Western hegemony and the opening of Western dominance, which is what they are living today. So just to close, going into the close, the colonial measure of power was created, transformed, managed by Western. They cannot control anymore. What we are looking at today is who called the shot. So de-Westernization is disputing the control of the colonial matrix of power. Financially, militarily, and I would say culturally, if I have time to say more about that, but I don't want to take too. I give you just one example. What happened in Doha? Doha is an exploitation, the exploiter of many people from India, etc., etc. So let me clarify this. There are two aspects in any state: the domestic and the international. When I'm talking about de-Westernization, I'm talking about interstate relations. I am not talking about the injustice that are being committed inside, and we should at some point talking about that, but my argument now is different. So when you look at the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, which is a kind of magnificent museum in many ways, and you look at some of the Sharjah Biennale, especially the Sharjah Biennale 11 and the Sharjah Biennale 14, you will see that there is a cultural de-Westernization. What I mean there, that cultural de-Westernization is made with a lot of money. Hor al-Qasimi pay, I think, 240 million for one Cézanne, the card players of 1994, to have it there. To say, well, you come here to see our art and Cézanne. Why we have to go to the Louvre or to the British Museum, etc.? So they are using the money not to make money. They are not buying Cézanne to just then sell it for more money. They don't need money. They have enough, right? They are rebuilding an identity that the West told them to despise. So that is the kind of the cultural de-Westernization. Through state, through economy, through a lot of money. But we cannot discount that, because we cannot pretend that the people who have money have no heart. And they are only interested in money. No, they know. They know that the kind of the West has made the kind of devil of the Muslim, every Muslim, right? So they are fighting against that image through culture. And now decoloniality is a different thing, because decoloniality is not a state project. Cannot be a decolonial state project. So Bolivia have a secretary of decolonization, but that is just pour la galerie, as the French would say. Because the state is already, I mean, that secretary is part of de-Westernization, even if they call it decoloniality. Decoloniality is us. Is the people who are organizing ourselves politically in whatever we do. Because we began to understand that we cannot expect much from the state and cannot expect much from the corporation. Perhaps there are some good donors that give us some money to do some research and some exhibit, and we have to use it. But the question is to use it and not let them to use us, because they are using us. When somebody gave us money to do something, they are using us. Okay, we have to be aware of that, and at the same time use them. So decoloniality is going in that direction. And so to close, I will say that when I talk about decoloniality, I'm talking in two ways. One is the way I understand decoloniality, as I told you at the beginning, and what I will see as decolonial process, even if the people who does it, they don't call themselves decolonial. So all the kind of struggle we see today here in Aitaora, by the airport, all the kind of the struggle of indigenous people, all the struggle for kind of women of color, gay, lesbian, etc., all that I call decolonization, the decoloniality, even if they don't call it. Why I call decoloniality? Because they are struggling, trying to delink from the colonial magic of power that racialize them, sexualize them, dehumanifies them, etc., etc., etc. So in that sense, Abya Yala and La Gran Comarca in Latin America are sites today that they are not taking Latin America for granted anymore. See, Latin America is your problem. We have to rebuild ourselves, and the concept of the communal, rebuilding the communal, is very important because you cannot rebuild society. Society has already in the hands of the state. So you have to rebuild something else. The indigenous people know what the communal is because they've always been. So, and we have to learn, and whoever we are, we don't have to be indigenous, but the sense of the communal is helping ourselves, relation of collaboration, of love, of respect, of living together, not necessarily because Barth said in living together, because we have to live together because it's a human necessity. Right? So I will stop there, and I hope that I give you some idea of what I'm thinking about the idea of Latin America.